During its first 100 years, there is virtually no difference between Christian material culture and the material culture of the Roman Empire surrounding this small group of Christians. Early Christians used the pre-existing imagery surrounding them. They used images such as fish, anchors, grapes, and vines, and gave these images their own significance. They had their own meaning. Early Christians used the language of imperial Rome, but they subverted that language. They turned that language on its head. Whereas imperial Rome used imagery and language to proclaim the divinity of the emperor, early Christians turned those images and that language on their head to proclaim the name of the one true God. Early Christians were influenced by classical Rome and Greece, and throughout the Middle Ages, Christians continued to be influenced by Roman imagery and classical imagery, materials, methods, and artwork. We will see how Roman imagery continues to be very influential, even as it's interpreted in a variety of ways. Early Christians were also influenced by Jewish artwork, and this makes sense because nearly all of the early Christians were Jews. Christianity comes out of Judaism because, of course, Jesus himself is Jewish. How did Christians respond to the visual culture around them? Well, let's begin with Clement of Alexandria. His quote shows how early Christians reinterpreted the images that were already available in use to make them point towards the truth of their faith. So he says, "Let our seals be either a dove or a fish, or a ship scudding before the wind." So he's talking about using readily available images. And then he says, "If there be one fishing, he will remember the apostle and the children drawn out of the water." So an image of a fisherman would be interpreted by the Christians as a reference to the apostles fishing for people. On the other hand, non-Christians might not interpret the image in the same way, so there's double meaning here. He says, "For we are not to delineate the faces of idols, we who are prohibited to cleave to them, nor a sword nor a bow, following as we do peace, nor drinking cups, being temperate. Many of the licentious have their lovers engraved, or their mistresses, as if they wished to make it impossible ever to forget their amatory indulgences, by being perpetually put in mind of their licentiousness." The only rule was that Christians not make images of things that are immoral or things that go against their faith. Christians were not the elites of Roman culture. For about 150 years, their imagery is no different from other Roman imagery because they did not develop their own artists, but employed Roman artists to depict the themes that were important to them. Another influence was Judaism. In the 19th century, it was assumed that Jews had no images, and so thus that early Christians had no images. But a place called Dura Europos refutes that. It was discovered in the 1920s. It was a place that was preserved, buried underground from the year 257 CE until it was discovered. The images found, such as this one, on a synagogue wall were preserved that entire time. One thing you might know about Jewish law is that it prohibits the creation of images in the likeness of God. But Jewish art did incorporate figurative imagery. It was imagery that was inspired by classical Greek and Roman art. In this image from the synagogue in Dura Europos, Moses is pictured twice. First, he's parting the sea so that the Israelites can walk through it, and then he points his staff again so that the Egyptians will drown. We'll see this use of the staff, the imagery of the staff, filled with power, almost like a magic wand. We'll see it in Christian imagery as well, so let's look at that now. These paintings are from catacombs. Catacombs were where Christians buried their dead. Loculi are, so to speak, the little bunk beds of the dead. It's where they were buried. Figures from the Old Testament for Christians are types or prefigurations of Christ in the New Testament. The Old Testament is not cut off from the New Testament in Christianity, but the Messiah is considered to be present in the Old Testament as well as in the New Testament. So this wand, we see it again here. It was used by Moses to part the sea, and now it's being used by Jesus. He in this image is raising Lazarus. So you can see Lazarus in his tomb wrapped up in burial cloths, and Jesus uses his staff, his wand, you could say, to impart the power to raise Lazarus from the dead. The symbolism of this piece has as much to do with where the image is placed as it does the image itself. Just over the opening where the dead would be laid is this image of Christ raising Lazarus. Thus, the image is a hopeful reality for the person who has died. This person believes that just like Lazarus, he or she will also rise from the dead when Christ comes again. This is the basic concept of the resurrection, Christ having risen from the dead, and believers in him also trusting that they too will be raised from the dead. This will happen to the body, and it's painted right on the oculus itself. Orant figures are figures praying, and the orant is not only a Christian motif, but it also is a figure that shows up in Jewish and pagan imagery. So once again, early Christians were using the imagery in their surrounding culture. Orant figures are holding their hands up. It's the stance of those in prayer in the early church. They did not sit with their hands folded, but lifted their hands, just as this image shows. Here we have Christ as the Good Shepherd, and it might be a little bit difficult to see, but in the center here is Christ with a sheep on his shoulders. The Good Shepherd is, in pagan art, refers to Apollo or Hermes, or the shepherd Orpheus among the animals. But for early Christians, the Good Shepherd was none other than Christ himself, as Psalm 23 indicates, Matthew 18, and John 10, and elsewhere. Roman and Christian cultures are woven together then, when Christianity starts out as this minority religion and then becomes dominant. Now, how did Christianity become the dominant religion? A key to the rise of Christianity is one individual, the Emperor Constantine. Here he is. He saw himself as Apollo and then the unconquered son of Near Eastern mystery religion before he became a Christian. Then he takes on Christianity. He's converted when he sees a sign in the sky, and Christianity is made legal in 313. Then it becomes the imperial religion. It's no longer the oppressed minority, the religion of slaves. Even though he was mostly in the East, his statue was his presence. The statue was the same as the presence of the emperor in Rome. So while he was not there, his statue could fill in. We've seen this with other Roman emperors. Rome also influenced Christian architecture. Did you know that what we think of as the shape of a traditional Christian church is actually the shape of a Roman basilica? Early Christian longitudinal churches are based on the form of the Roman basilica, which was an imperial audience hall. So we have the nave, the narthex, the aisles, they all derive from the Roman basilica. But the Christians do innovate. They insert the transept. It makes the plan of the building look like a cross. It's perpendicular to the nave. This is an interior image of Old St. Peter's, and it could hold 14,000 people. Now, how else does Roman imagery impact Christianity? We see a seamless melding of Christian and pagan themes. And we see that in this mosaic. It includes a bust portrait of Constantina in the center, and there's a decorative motif of grapevines, as well as naked cherubs. They trample grapes to make wine, and this could be associated with the cult of Bacchus, the god of wine. But for Christians, it also refers to the Eucharist. For Christian eyes, the meaning could also refer to the wine, the body and blood of Jesus, the wine in the Eucharist. And so now we see a continuation of that idea that Clement of Alexandria expressed, that Christians can take imagery from the surrounding culture, and it can have a double meaning. Those images can mean something to the Christians that might not be perceived by others in that culture. So in Byzantium, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, we have a new Rome. Rome was declining in power in the 5th and 6th centuries, and Byzantium became the replacement for Rome and the cultural center of the Western world. We see a continuation of the use of Roman imperial imagery in the Byzantine Empire. There's a shift in representations of Christ now, because now we're talking about an imperial God, an imperial Christ. He goes from being the youthful good shepherd to the imperial king. In this image in the oratory of Galla Placidia, the image of Jesus reveals that he's imperial king with purple and gold robes. He has a halo now. He no longer has the shepherd crook. He's no longer portrayed as a simple shepherd, but as a king. Christian art is now officially part of the empire. Now, in this particular building where this mosaic is found, we have a very plain exterior. And the plain exterior contrasts with the elaborate interior, the elaborate mosaics on the inside. It's a transition designated to enact the passage from earth to heaven, from the earthly, the mundane, to the supernatural. And this idea of transition from earth to heaven is nowhere more evident than with this cross in the midst of starry heavens on the dome. You can see it, you have to look up at it from below. It represents and makes present an experience of paradise. As you know, we always discuss context in this course. Context is very important as you look at works of art, because you have to know how the art was understood in its original context. It existed in some sort of cultural context. And in this case, we have works of art we're seeing that would have existed in the context of worship spaces. When you look at this work, don't forget to think about the candlelight, liturgy, and incense that would be surrounding it in the worship space. In the East, one of the most remarkable churches ever built was constructed in the 6th century. The Emperor Justinian employed two architects, one who studied geometry and optics, and another who was a physicist who studied vaulting, to design this innovative piece of architecture. Here we see the most innovative use of a dome and pendentives up to that point. This massive building is an obvious display of power. Its most magnificent feature of many is the dome in the center, which is remarkable because it almost seems to float. There are a variety of reasons, all contributing to this illusion that the dome is floating on air. The first is that there's a ring of windows at the dome's base which allow light. It looks as if the dome is supported simply by a ring of light. The second reason is that the supporting piers are obscured, along with the pendentives that connect the dome to the supporting piers. The piers are submerged in the darkness of the aisles, and so it's as if the usual supports are not even there. A third reason is that the use of gold mosaic covers the surface of the dome and pendentives. This use of gold reflects light, causing the supported walls to also dissolve into light. And we will see throughout this lecture the way that light is a central theme of Christian architecture in the medieval period. Inside Hagia Sophia, the liturgy celebrated is the Eucharist. It's different than the Protestant or Catholic Eucharist that we may know today. If you are Protestant or Catholic, although if you are Orthodox, this liturgy would be more familiar to you. The Mass was celebrated behind a screen, or later behind an iconostasis. An iconostasis is a wall hung with devotional images, such as images of saints. The focus of the congregation then is either on that wall of images, the iconostasis, or on the dome. They are elevating their eyes to heaven. They are putting into practice what spiritual writers of the time advocated for Christians to meditate in order to be elevated from the material world into the spiritual. San Vitale shows another example of an absentee emperor making sure his presence is felt. Just like Constantine was not present in Rome, Justinian and his wife, the Empress Theodora, probably never went to Ravenna, Italy, where these images are located. These are mosaics. Justinian and Theodora are pictured in these mosaics facing each other in the apse, so these are facing each other mosaics. They're both wearing purple robes, color that represents royalty, they have halos, and they're presenting gifts to the church and therefore to Christ. Just as the Magi on Theodora's cloak offer gifts to Jesus. You can't see them, but they're pictured here. The Magi are giving gifts to Jesus. The style of the figures is interesting. The use of shadow creates a sense of modeling and three-dimensionality on the facial features. So the faces have a little bit of modeling. But the figures are in very shallow spaces. They cast no shadows, and they appear very flat. The mosaic paintings are both flattened and three-dimensional. They're both abstract and representational. They're both patterned and individualized. In Galla Placidia, the difference between the plain exterior, as we saw here, and the ornate interior is a metaphor for the contrast between heaven and earth. In these images of the emperor and Theodora, a similar metaphor is at work, the metaphor between the natural and the supernatural. So the natural is what we can observe, careful observations, just like the Greeks did in their sculptures. On the other hand, an Orthodox icon is both natural and supernatural because while observing nature, it also offers an encounter with the divine. And sometimes that abstraction and use of pattern, the eschewing of space, is a way of pointing to a realm beyond the material world. So the big question at the time that preoccupied people was, how do we depict God in art? They want their art to be an avenue towards God, but how do you do that? They inherited certain iconography and certain ideas from imperial Roman culture. So for example, when the emperors had images made of themselves, subjects were expected to treat the image with the same reverence that they would treat the person the image depicts. In another way of saying that is that the honor given to the person, the honor given to the image is the same as the honor given to the prototype of the image. In addition, when the emperor was not in a particular city, his statue or his image was like his presence. We've seen this with Constantine and with other emperors, Augustus. In the same way, an icon offers the presence of Christ. In fact, icons were not meant as illustrations of biblical texts. They were meant for those who were already Christians, already initiated into the faith, as aids to worship. Icons were these intermediaries between human beings and the holy figures that they represented. However, they were not meant to be worshipped. They could make an encounter with the divine possible, but they were not God themselves. The theology behind this comes out of an interpretation of Scripture. Colossians 1:15 says, Christ is the image of the invisible God. So Christ came as an image, the image of the invisible God. So in that way, images are legal. Images can depict Christ's human nature. On the other hand, they're incapable of depicting his divine nature. God could be present in an icon because God is present everywhere on earth. However, there's a distinction between how Greeks made gods in their own images and how Romans made their emperors divine, and how Christians would depict God, because God is always beyond the body. God the Father cannot be pictured, but Christ, because he was made in a human body, can be pictured. However, his divinity is always beyond the body. So Christian art aimed at this unity, leading the faithful to God through images that go beyond the body and beyond images. So using an image to go beyond the image. It's kind of mysterious. People who supported icons used these arguments, but there were others in the 8th century who rejected icons. Those who rejected icons were called iconoclasts. This is something that rears its head at different points in history, the destruction of images. Today we see it with ISIS destroying statues. Iconoclasm means image breaking in Greek. This desire to destroy images had multiple root causes. For one thing, Muslims are aniconic, or in other words, they do not encourage images. And Muslim invaders came and they were succeeding in battle. So Christian emperors thought that perhaps God was displeased with them for carrying the image of Mary when they went into battle. Theologically, iconoclasts worried about idolatry. On the other hand, besides the military issue, they worried about the worship of images. But there was one place, the monastery of St. Catherine in Mount Sinai, that was far away enough to escape the iconoclastic controversy. The Sinai Christ and the Sinai Peter and Theotokos and Child with Saints show Roman-style paintings. Oh, I don't have the image of the Sinai Christ. I have Theotokos, which is the Virgin and Child with Saints, and St. Peter. They're Roman style. So do you see the use of shadow, the use of modeling, especially in this figure, but in both of them, the faces are modeled and observed like Roman-style painting. But the saints here are more stylized. They're more flat. So that's this melding of two styles, the more idealized and the more naturalized. The Roman Empire fell into the hands of the barbarians from the north, and so now we turn our attention to the land of those barbarians, what is now the rest of Europe. At the time we are examining, however, there is no such thing as Europe. The countries we are familiar with today, such as Great Britain, France, Spain, or Germany, did not exist in the way that we know them. Today we are entering medieval Europe. The term Middle Ages is a somewhat derogatory term. It stems from the belief that Europe, from the end of the Roman Empire until the dawn of the modern period, was in its dark ages. However, this notion is misguided. We will see a cultural period that is brilliantly complex, diverse, and has an immense amount of beauty. It's rather than a shadowy or dark period. Most of the barbarians adopted Christianity. They were called barbarians because the Greeks had this word barbar, which was just basically gibberish language that they did not know. So barbarians becomes the word for people who speak languages that they do not know. They adopted Christianity as they came in contact with the Roman Empire in the 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries. And as we look at medieval art in Northern Europe, the Byzantine Empire is still alive and well. It's still influencing Europe. There is at the same time this cross-pollination between different cultures that are all united by the Christian faith. The Northern Europeans bring their own artistic traditions and even their own pagan religious practices into the mix. The Book of Kells and also the Book of Durrow are illuminated manuscripts, and it took an incredible amount of time to create these books. They were very precious because they were painted on vellum. Vellum is dried animal skin. Imagine if every time you needed a piece of paper, you had to slaughter a calf, dry its skin, prepare the vellum. Obviously, this process made books very rare. The Book of Kells was produced on vellum. It shows the decorative traditions of the British Isles. The decorative motifs amplify the text, and they give the text importance. So you can see the letter here, but the letter is becoming more than a letter. It's becoming a visual image as well. These are the local traditions of monastic life in the 8th century. But Christianity originally came from Rome, and Rome was influential in this region as well. You can compare the Codex Amitinus from Wearmouth Jarrow and Matthew illustrating his gospel from the Lindisfarne Gospel. They reveal different interpretations of the Roman artistic tradition. Both of these images come from the same Roman prototype. They are inspired by the same Roman image, but they interpret that image in different ways. Ezra, on the right side, is situated in a space, right? It has perspective. Whereas Matthew, on the left, sits against a blank, flat background. Only his bench, the carpet at his feet, and the curtain provide some context. Ezra has modeled features, an illusion of painting that constructs shading. Three-dimensional modeling and a sense of space come from Rome, while the flat and decorative tradition of the British Isles assert themselves, even as the artist acknowledges Rome by basing the image off of the Roman prototype. So Rome is influential, but there's a mixture of cultures here. Northern Europe is influenced by Rome, but it's not but it's not close enough to Rome to be overly influenced. It retains its own cultural uniqueness. The page illustrating Matthew writing his gospel comes from the Lindisfarne Gospel, and it demonstrates the artist intentionally suppressing the classical style of depicting space and modeling figures in favor of emphasizing a local artistic tradition. So they knew about modeling, they knew about creating space, but they favored their own cultural heritage. We see the Roman influence on sculpture in this sculpture of Charlemagne. This is Charles the Bald, grandson of Charlemagne. Charlemagne established a dynasty known today as the Carolingian Empire, which extended through present-day France, Germany, and Belgium, Holland, and Italy. And this is a smaller equestrian statue of Charles the Bald, and it's based off of the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius, shown here. At the time, this was thought to be a representation of Constantine, who was, of course, the first Christian Roman emperor, and so Charles the Bald wanted to depict himself in line with Constantine. The statue makes it very clear how Charles the Bald was fashioning his image. He would like to be associated with a Roman emperor who was also a Christian. At the same time, the sculpture is not an exact copy of the statue of Marcus Aurelius. How it is done in a distinctly Northern European style. Intellectual life in the Romanesque period in Northern Europe involved the establishment of the first universities in towns that are still famous for their universities, such as Bologna, Paris, Oxford, and Cambridge. Out of this intellectual milieu comes the Romanesque. That is the name given to this style in the 19th century because it resembled the stone buildings of the Roman period. There are a few identifying features of the Romanesque. One feature is the use of the rounded arch. See that rounded arch? It is influenced, of course, by Roman architecture. The ceilings of churches were now made of stone rather than wood, and stone masonry had become very popular because of its durability, of course, and its capacity to protect. The Church of Saint Vincent from the early 1000s is an example of an early Romanesque building, or the first Romanesque, because it relies on stone vaulting on the ceiling and masonry construction. This church's stone masonry and rounded arches are inspired by Roman architecture. And then we see the importance of pilgrimage. Pilgrimage in medieval society was very prominent. The relics of holy sites were considered to have healing power. So people might travel long distances to seek that healing. So a church might hold relics such as these. Pilgrimage was another sort of tourism as well. It exposed pilgrims to different cultures and places. Pilgrims went to Jerusalem, to Rome, and to other holy sites, such as this church, the Cathedral of St. James in Santiago de Compostela. The traditional basilica in this church is enhanced. It's enhanced in this period by the construction of transepts with little radiating chapels. So the transept, if you remember, is what crosses over that main aisle, the main nave, and then the little radiating chapels around the transept and apse here. The apse is the rounded section of the top of the church. These little chapels give the pilgrims something to do when they visit. They're hordes of people. They are here. They need somewhere to go and something to look at. So they are allowed to enter in the sides of the church and enter into these small chapels. These chapels could then accommodate the pilgrims without disrupting the service that was going on, and people in the middle could attend. So these relics were draws for people, and they helped support these churches. Monumental stone sculpture emerges as integral to the building of Romanesque churches. Pilgrims flocked to these facades. These were on the outside of the church buildings because they wanted to see the dramas of scripture and human life that were played out before their eyes in these relief sculptures. There were no movie theaters. but sculptural relief could grip their attention, and you can see why. These are gruesome stories. The tympanum over the door is an important place for the narrative drama. That's where this would be, right over the door. For one thing, it offers a message to those who are coming in, as well as those going out. Many stories are told simultaneously, which is the advantage of sculpture rather than television or film. Lots of things can be happening all at once. This depiction of the Last Judgment shows Christ. He's in the typical mandorla, that is the shape surrounding him, and he has a halo. The halo has a cross. Some of the people are going to hell and others are going to heaven. The Last Judgment is more likely to be depicted on the west portal, the western door, like as this one is, because it's a symbol of the setting sun. The west is where the sun sets at the end of the day, and the end of the day becomes symbolic of the end of time or the end of our lives. This sort of symbolism was carefully inserted into the building of churches. Everything had meaning. For example, Christ's right hand is the place of honor, so those going to heaven are on his right, while those on his left are being dragged down to hell. Why, one might ask, is this Romanesque style less realistic than the Roman style, even though it's purportedly influenced by it? The Romanesque style is influenced by Rome, but the medieval interest is very different from that of the ancient world. Art is made not to investigate the natural realm or imitate the natural world, but to portray God's realm, portray something about heavenly, spiritual realities. The Romanesque artist had a technique of portraying narrative scenes in the top of the columns. So this is a capital, which is what you would put on the top of a column. So there's a little bit of space there. And so these are not very big. This is a whimsical depiction of the Magi being startled awake by the angel. You can see one guy with his eyes popped open. And here we have Mary carrying Jesus into Egypt. It conveys the human qualities of religious stories. And now turning from the Romanesque, we move into the Gothic period. This is the time of the ascendance of Gothic architecture in the 12th and 13th centuries. Gothic architecture is a Northern European style rather than a Southern European style. It is uniquely Northern European. It comes out of France, Northern Europe. It does not emerge in Rome or Italy. The first Gothic building is Saint-Denis, pictured here. It's the Church of the Benedictine Abbey, and Saint-Denis was extremely wealthy. It was a wealthy church. Kings were buried there. The first Gothic church was started in the 1130s, and it has many features that were already present in Romanesque buildings. So given that many features of Saint-Denis were already present in Romanesque buildings, what, might you ask, makes it uniquely Gothic? Why is it uniquely Gothic? Why is this church called the first Gothic building? Saint-Denis has an apse surrounded by an ambulatory with radiating chapels, just as we saw with, go back, show you what that means again. Oops, excuse me. The radiating chapels, right? At the apse, Saint-Denis has that. Saint-Denis has pointed arches, but you could also see pointed arches and groin vaults in Romanesque architecture. It also has external buttressing, but this was also an innovation that Romanesque architects used to support their structures. And so we might ask again, why was Saint-Denis the first Gothic building? What made it so unique? What made it uniquely Gothic? Well, what makes it different is light. Saint-Denis achieves, by using these different features already present in the Romanesque, a flowing open space filled with light. Abbot Suger is the guy behind the project. He's able to employ non-load-bearing walls with that external buttressing. And the reason that this is so essential is that it allows him to incorporate much more stained glass than ever before. So he combines a bunch of different aspects of the Romanesque to enhance the use of light. And if you remember, we saw that same the same relevance of light in Hagia Sophia. Because the thing is, if a wall must bear if a wall must bear weight, the amount of glass is limited because glass cannot bear weight. If the weight is then taken off the walls and distributed elsewhere, such as on the external buttressing, then the architect is free to make these walls of glass. And glass lets in light. This is the true innovation of the Gothic style. Suger advocated for the glory and lavish beauty of the church. His desire is to glorify God and to glorify the kings buried in his church. We know that Abbot Suger's primary goal is to fill the church with light, and that is based on his theology, in which God is light. Excuse me. God is light, God fills the whole world with light, and the world thus becomes radiant with light. In this way, contemplating light allows a person to be lifted up to God. Suger is obsessed with light because the contemplation of light is a way to contemplate God who fills all things with light. So his theology says that just as light from the sun comes through a stained glass window, it becomes a metaphor for the light of God shining through creation and the material world. Architects continue to innovate. At Reims Cathedral, bar tracery becomes an innovation that allows for even more light. It's made up of thin stone bars that are inserted into the openings in the wall, and these narrow bars create the frameworks for the glass. This made possible even larger areas of stained glass in relation to the wall surface. Stained glass is this kind of monumental painting at the time. At the time, instead of murals or mosaics, stained glass is the way of expressing what would have been expressed in painting, and what today we would think of as going to the movie theater. This is what they had as their multimedia form of entertainment. So as we've seen, the Middle Ages were not really dark ages. In fact, light was central to the architecture in the Middle Ages. It's a period of rich, powerful, complex art and architecture that is rooted in the Christian faith, but also, as we've seen again and again, borrows from the classical period and beyond.